in your Bibles this morning in the book of Genesis, and chapter number 37. I'm going to give a little bit of a prelude here to the actual passage, because we're kind of wrapping up a really big, broad. I don't like saying story, because you say Bible story, and it's hard to, to put that in belief. But this record that we have of an event that went down in history, of a guy named Joseph. Of course, most of us are going to be familiar with Joseph, right? But with all of the most recent events here in our messed up world and country, there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of families that have some grudges, and would be deemed rightfully so in the logic that America uses and that we use as humans and in our emotions. And we're going to look at a man who had a right to have a grudge. And so we're going to read a little bit of his story here, of his account. But first, if you're not familiar with the passage, I'll give you a quick kind of speed read of the life of Joseph. So we'll start with Joseph's father, Jacob, right? He wanted to marry this woman that he thought was beautiful. He thought would make him a good wife. And, of course, her name was Rachel. And he went to Rachel's father and said, hey, I want to marry your daughter. And so Laban said, basically, Laban made Jacob work for 7 years before he decided he was going to give Jacob Rachel. So 7 years went by, and Jacob got bamboozled and ended up marrying a girl named Leah, right? So Jacob still wanted to marry Rachel, so 7 years later, after 7 more years of work, he got to marry Rachel, because Leah was the firstborn. That was Laban's logic and the whole thing. And the firstborn, she wasn't married yet. So finally, Jacob marries Rachel, and so Jacob immediately is experiencing this favoritism towards Rachel because she was the one that he originally wanted, and she couldn't have kids. So they went for a long time without kids, and Jacob had several kids with Leah. And finally, Rachel had a boy, and that boy's name was Joseph. And right away, just like with the marriage, in the fatherhood, Jacob favored Joseph. And it wasn't hidden. He didn't try to hide it at all. Jacob favored Joseph. And when you see through all the different things that, of course, the coat of many colors, that would probably be something most of us are familiar with, but this in and of itself was probably enough to make Joseph's brothers sore at him. But there was more that got added to the fire. Of course, Joseph had the dreams about the sheaves of hay and the straw, or the stars, where, in these dreams, he goes and tells his brothers that, hey, according to these dreams, you guys are going to be bound down to me one day. And I can only imagine, how brothers are, right? And I can only imagine there was a little bit of tone in the way that Joseph was telling these dreams. There was probably a little bit of bragging or nagging or something that was added on there. And at any rate, through this course of events and the earlier part of Joseph's life, his brothers had become extremely jealous. They weren't okay with how everything was being handled, and one day they were way off away from their father, and Jacob sent Joseph to go check on the rest of his brothers. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up here in Genesis chapter number 37. I'm going to read chapter 37. I'm going to read a few verses here. We're going to start in verse number 23. Genesis 37 says, And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bringing spices and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content. So here they are. They'd been planning to kill him. And they decided, well, yeah, he is our brother after all. Maybe we shouldn't kill him. So let's just sell him into slavery. That's better. And so they were all satisfied with this option of selling him. And there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they brought Joseph into Egypt. And Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. So Joseph, probably by most of our judgment of what's fair and what's not fair, would have been pretty fair to have a grudge for being, almost killed, and then sold into slavery. I mean, you got to think his life was turned upside down. It wasn't like today where, as a kid going through middle school and high school, you have 50, 60, 70 friends or acquaintances. You know, you go to public school and, you know, you have people other than your family. You're not super close to your family, relatively speaking to what used to be. You know, there's not many family dinners anymore. There's really not. The family is becoming a thing of the past, unfortunately. However, that was all Joseph had. I mean, we don't really read an account of where Joseph had other friends growing up. So these who had been closest to him completely betrayed him, sold him into slavery, and left him. So Joseph is probably thinking that he's never going to see his father again. Of course, they went back and told his father that he'd been killed. If you read the rest of the account here, they went back and told Jacob that Joseph had been killed. So Joseph probably had a right to have a grudge. An Oxford professor once said this: everyone thinks forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have to forgive somebody. I think that's probably true. You know, it's easy to armchair quarterback stuff like this, right? Where you sit back and say, oh, well, you know, they hurt you, but the Bible says we're supposed to forgive, so you need to forgive them. When you've been hurt, it's not that simple. It isn't. I mean, you and I both know that. When it's personal and it's deep, forgiveness is a hard thing. It's a difficult thing. And I'm sure that it was the same in Joseph's life. I think we could all agree that forgiveness, this release of bitterness, is a powerful thing, right? And shortly, we're going to jump into a few things that forgiveness is and a few things that forgiveness isn't, right? And then we're going to cap it all off with some practical application. I'm not going to be long this morning. Some practical application that is super, super simple. It's not easy, but it's very simple, that we can walk out of here today with an application and something to do so that we don't just come and listen and not learn anything, right? And anybody that's ever preached will tell you this. The messages you preach when you're studying and you're preparing, you're convicted by it, right? Because God is pointing out all these places in your life. Like, I'm not any better than any of you guys. I'm just the one holding a microphone, right? I'm just the one that's reading. I'm not any better in any way than any of you guys. I struggle with forgiveness probably more than anybody else in here. So this is hard for me. But what we're going to look at is hard truth that if we call ourselves Christians, we need to apply. So let's jump in. So how does this process begin? We agree that forgiveness is a powerful thing, but I want to say this. We're going to look at it this way, a little bit backwards, right? I would argue that bitterness, the opposite of forgiveness, or unforgiveness, is just as important and possibly more impactful in our current day, like in the present, than forgiving. Because bitterness grows. The Bible talks about bitterness like a root, right? It springs up. Now, what does that imply? If it's a root, that means that it's going to grow. It's going to get worse. And everybody in here that struggles with bitterness knows that it doesn't just sit there and disappear, right? The longer it doesn't get dealt with, the worse it gets. It just kind of sits in there and festers and boils, and eventually it all comes out and it's ugly. We're going to look at the impact of unforgiveness. But how do we begin this forgiveness process? First, we should probably realize and admit our part in a conflict. And again, not every time that somebody hurts us have we had anything to do with it. But there is times where we're just as guilty as the other party, and we hold this bitterness, and that blinds us. So we need to be able to look at the situation unbiasedly and go, okay, is there any place in this situation that I've messed up that I need to get right with first, that I need to get right with God and with this person that I'm angry at, or these people, or this institution that I'm angry against? And this verse here that I'm about to share, that we're all familiar with, is going to strip us of our right to be angry, right? There's a few that we could use here, but this one is probably the best. It's Romans 6:23. Says, for all have sinned, come short of the glory of God, right? So, if I've sinned and they've sinned, that makes us both sinners, which means I don't have any more ground to stand on than they do. This person that I'm upset, the person that I'm angry against does. When we look at the state that we are in, right, that all of us are in collectively, we're all sinners, we're all guilty in the sight of God, and we know that that the wages of sin is death. And that word death doesn't mean physical death. That word death is speaking of a spiritual separation from God, which is accompanied by an eternity spent in a place called hell. Harsh as it is, truth is truth. So when we look at the state that we're all in, we see that we are all with the same status as every other man on earth. We are all sinners in need of forgiveness. And we got to ask God for forgiveness because we are all in need of it. Forgiveness is one of those things that's difficult to give because we're prideful, right? We think that we deserve everything. We think that we are all this and more. And in reality, we're nothing. God created us out of dust with one purpose. He wanted a relationship with us. He could have created us to be mindless drones that didn't have a free will, didn't have the option to choose. But he didn't. He created us because he loved us. He wanted a working relationship with us. And here Joseph has a clear choice. He can forgive his brothers or he can hold his bitterness. But I want to look at a few things here as we go. This was a horrible situation from the inside. To be in Joseph's shoes had to have been horrible, right? But when we look at the outcome, God had everything under control. And I think it worked out pretty well for all parties involved. When you look at the outcome, as difficult as it was to go through for Joseph, pretty solid outcome. We're going to look at the last few verses here in just a second. But let's look at the importance of forgiveness. We all want it, but we aren't all willing to give it, right? It's made clear in the Bible that if we don't give it, we're not going to receive it. And we see that in the book of Matthew. And I believe it's going to be in Matthew chapter number 6. I should have written this one down, but I didn't. But in the Gospel of Matthew, we're told that if we're not willing to forgive as Christ has forgiven us, then Christ isn't going to forgive us. It's that simple. Forgiveness is a huge deal. And so forgiveness is important because if we're not willing to forgive and we're holding bitterness, knowingly holding bitterness, we don't have communication with God. Because we are knowingly in a state of rebellion, and there's a harsh fact that if we're not willing to forgive, because God has forgiven us, right? we've already established that all of us are guilty of sin. One sin, a million sins equals one thing. It equals sin. And sin equals punishment. We're all in need of this forgiveness. And if we're not willing to give it, we're not going to receive it. Forgiveness isn't fun. It's not something that we're going to enjoy because we're letting go of control when we forgive. We're letting go of the moral high ground that we believe that we have when we forgive, right? By forgiving, we see a lot of misconceptions. We're going to talk about this in a second. If I forgive them, they're winning, or by forgiving them, I'm condoning their actions. It's not the case. But if that's what you're thinking about forgiveness, I suggest you're viewing it incorrectly. Forgiveness probably does more for you. It does. Forgiveness does more for you than the person that you forgive, because people who don't forgive are stuck in the past, dwelling on this memory, this event, and this leads to bitterness. And the effects of bitterness are huge. You can Google this and fact check me. There's a lot of studies out there where emotions affect your physical health, right? So there is studies been made that a positive outlook on life, positivity, optimism lead to a longer average lifespan in those who are generally an optimist. And there is proven scientific research that angry people who dwell on bitterness and who are have really, really quick tempers, they've got heart issues, blood pressure, depression, and jealousy that can also come from unforgiveness, can lead to more health problems, unhealthy eating habits, workaholism, addictions to mind-altering drugs like alcohol and other drugs, narcotics, tobacco, where we turn to because of this emotional state that we're in, and all of those have negative physical effects on our body. So bitterness isn't just a mental thing, but it can easily affect you physically. It's a big deal. And the longer that we hold this in, the more evident it becomes, the more powerful the effects are. But it also affects our future. Bitterness does. Not being willing to let go of my right to be angry at the people that hurt me. It keeps me from moving forward in my life because I'm too stuck dwelling on my past. It keeps me from moving to new levels of relationships with fear of further injury, trust problems, because I'm not willing to put what has happened in the past. I keep it right here with me. On top of all this, it's likely, like we just talked about, that depression is going to gain a stronghold in your life, and depression can wreck your life. It really can. Unforgiveness has all these effects and more, but the most damaging is the communication disruption that we just talked about with God in Matthew chapter 6 and verse number 14, where he says, "For if ye forgive men their trespasses, your Father will also forgive you. But if you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." Forgiveness is important. If you look in the model prayer that we see in the Gospels, forgiveness is in the model prayer. I never realized that, and it had never stuck out to me until I was studying for this message. But forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. That's supposed to be now. We don't recite the model prayer as that's not just a repetition that we do. That was supposed to be like an outline for this is a good organization, a good just idea of way to organize your thoughts when you're praying. But forgiveness, I never knew that. That just stuck out to me and kind of shocked me. I was like, I feel like I should have known that. Forgiveness is a big deal. So what is it? What is it? What isn't it? Forgiveness is giving up my right to seek revenge or retaliation for someone's actions towards me, but it's not condoning their actions. Nowhere in the Bible does biblical forgiveness mean that we get to condone sin. It's very possible to state facts without hurting feelings or exacting our judgment and revenge on people. It's okay to tell someone that they hurt you without hurting them back. There's a way to talk to people with love and compassion and say, hey, that wasn't cool. I'm not okay with that. But to keep love in it and to keep bitterness and anger out of it. God won't let a believer hurt you without convicting them and punishing them. And it's not your place to do so or to enjoy watching God punish somebody for something they've done to you. We hear the verse, vengeance is mine. We're going to say this here in a minute. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And jokingly, we always hear that and chuckle and go, aha, God's going to get them. We shouldn't be happy about that. Because we're also told that we're supposed to love our enemies. We're supposed to pray for those that despitefully use us. I'm a bitter person. Somebody messes me over one time, I might not ever speak to them again. Let alone pray for them. But it's commanded. We're supposed to. Forgiveness is loving the offender. It's not always reconciling. This is important, right? Forgiveness doesn't mean that you have to reconcile with the person you're forgiving or restore the relationship. That's not in there either. There's a lot of misconceptions here. There are instances. Now, restoration, forgiveness is necessary for restoration. Forgiveness is necessary for reconciling these relationships. And biblical reconciliation is a wonderful thing. When two believers have an issue, build up resentment towards each other, get that taken care of, and the relationship returns back to what it was before, that is amazing, right? And that is the ultimate goal. But there are instances where that's simply not possible. And that's okay. Biblical reconciliation is a beautiful thing, but sometimes it's not in the cards. There are times and instances where there is no bridge to a functioning reconciliation. However, love has to still exist in order for us to be in communion with the Lord. As difficult as it is, we are supposed to love our enemies and pray for those who despitefully use us. In Matthew 5:44, we see that. Forgiveness is a necessary element to this restoration. There are times that relationships shouldn't be restored to the capacity that it was before the collapse. And there are some cases where the relationship should probably just be left where it is. There are times where that's what needs to happen. But that doesn't mean that you're mean to them or cold to them. You still got to love them. I still got to love those people that hurt me. What forgiveness is, it is letting go of our bitterness. It is not forgetting what happened. In our text, we see that Joseph let go of any bitterness that he had, both towards his brothers and towards God, concerning the entire course of his life. Let's go ahead and read. We're going to go all the way to Genesis chapter 50. I want you guys to follow along with me on this one. So, there's a big gap here, and again, I'm going to kind of speed read. There was a big famine in the land, right? Well, first, Joseph was put in prison because as a slave, he served under Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife accused him of the sexual immoralities. Potiphar got mad at him, threw him in prison. So into prison he went. Joseph spent some serious time in prison. And through a series of events, basically God intervened in his life, and Joseph was thrust to the top of the entire Egyptian empire. And Joseph was essentially the second man in charge. He was the assistant to the head honcho of Egypt. And he had the ability to completely get revenge on his brothers, and thoroughly, because he's in charge, and God says, hey, through a dream that Pharaoh had, God revealed to Joseph that there was coming a famine, 7 years of good food was going to happen first, of good crops where everything was going to grow well. It was going to be followed by 7 years of famine where nothing was going to grow, and there was going to be a lot of people that were in need of food. So Joseph was able to be in charge of stockpiling food, essentially, for Egypt. And he did. And other countries would come and buy food off of Egypt for the 7 years of famine. Egypt survived the famine, and all the countries that would come and buy off of Egypt did as well. And so one day his brothers came by, and they didn't recognize Joseph. But Joseph sure did recognize them. And he had what we would probably deem as every right, and what we would probably, he did have every means that he needed to wreck their world. But let's read. Genesis chapter 50. Start with me, verse number 15. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us the evil which we did unto him. So they thought, as long as their dad was alive, they were going to be okay because Joseph wouldn't do anything for his father's sake. And so now they're worried. They're starting to panic a little bit. Dad's dead. Joseph's in charge. We messed up. And they sent a messenger to Joseph saying, thy father did command before he died, saying, which I don't think he did. I think Jacob probably would have told Joseph before he died that this, if Jacob had actually said this. But the brothers are here telling Joseph, hey, Dad commanded before he died, and he said, so shall ye say unto Joseph, forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren in their sin, for they did evil unto thee. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. So they're still afraid that Joseph's going to drop the hammer on them. And so they said, hey, Dad said, this is Dad, not us. Like, we understand we done messed up. We understand that, you got the right here to pound us into the ground. But Dad said you can't do that. He's asking you not to do that. And Joseph heard this and he started crying. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we're thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? Here it is. For am I in the place of God? When we choose and make the choice to not forgive somebody, we are attempting to take the place of God. Whoa. We are. And here's the thing. I know that I'm guilty of it. 1 time, 100 times, 200 times, many times, lots of times, more than I can count. Ouch. He said, am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. If those boys wouldn't have thrown Joseph into that pit and sold him into slavery, think about what would have happened to the country of Egypt. Joseph would have died later. He would have died from starvation. His whole family would have died. Egypt would have been in trouble. 7 years is a long time. There's no ecosystem or economy in the world right now that is prepared to survive 7 years with no plant growth. There's not. 7 years with no plant growth, especially at the time and place in the world that Egypt was way back then. The technology that they didn't have, there was no surviving that for most people. For 7 years, wasn't going to happen. But God provided. I'm sure Joseph didn't enjoy or like how it went down. Verse 21, now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. Through the whole thing, Joseph didn't say a cross word to them or about them. It's noon. I've already said enough cross words about people to get me in a heap of trouble today. Just on my way home from work, my dad. And Joseph went this whole time, after what his brothers did to him, and didn't. When he had all the right to, when he had all the means to, all the power, he didn't. So lastly, forgiveness isn't easy, right? We got to depend on God's grace, God's strength in our lives. Here it is. It depends on God. We have to depend on God. It doesn't depend in any way on the person we're forgiving. Right? That person that I need to forgive should not have to come ask for my forgiveness. They shouldn't. I should be forgiving them straight away. Now, is that easy? No. Is that what I want? No. In many instances, forgiveness isn't acknowledged, accepted, asked for, or reciprocated by the other party. It's not. It won't be. And this is one of the reasons that I said earlier that forgiveness is more important for the offended than for the offender in most cases. Because a lot of times they're not going to care. Because they're going to be convinced thinking that they're right. There's a lot of times they're going to think, I didn't hurt you. I didn't hurt you bad enough for this to be an issue. The release of the burden on our shoulders when bitterness and hatred is let go is such a relief that you've got to experience it yourself to understand how it feels. I mean, if you've ever had a tremendous amount of bitterness build up towards one person and let it go and given it to God, that relief is physical. It's physical. You can feel it. If you notice in our count this morning, we have no records of Joseph having a crossword, just love. His retaliation was love, kindness, compassion, provision. Paul says, forbearing one another and forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. We can't do it of ourselves. We got to give it to God. It's an act of faith in a God who is able and way more than willing to help us forgive. We got to ask for the strength. And here it is. Be honest with God. Talk to Him. That's what prayer is. We're getting ready to go into the application section, and I'm done. But what about after forgiveness? There are some things that happen in life that you can't forget. And you're going to be fighting bitterness every time that memory happens. Every time you see a text message, every time you walk past a person in Walmart, every time a mutual individual talks about them, or you see a picture, it's going to be there. So what do? You got to keep forgiving. And after the first time, the second time's easier. After the second time, the third time's easier. But again, it's not something that you're going to be able to do on your own, out of your own discipline, because we are emotional beings that are, quite frankly, in bondage to our emotions most of the time. It's something that we've got to be willing to let go of and say, okay, I don't have any rights. You know, in reality, as a Christian, we don't have any rights. When we accept the gift of salvation, right? The debt that is now paid, not by us. It was paid by the blood that Christ shed on the cross. When somebody pays a debt for you, that makes you a debtor. So we belong to God. It's not really our decision to make and be right with God anyway. It's His decision. Now, we take control all the time. We do. It's not right, but we do. Matthew 18:21 says, Then Peter came unto him and said, Lord, how often shall I forgive my brother's sin against me? I relate to Peter so much because Peter was such a up and down person, and he was just so eager to jump on things and eager to jump out of things. But he said, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Like, do I got to do this 7 times? And Jesus said, no, not 7, but 70 times 7. And the illustration there isn't actually the number. What Jesus is saying is forever. Every time. Every time. Chances are you're going to have to forgive this person more than one time. So for a while, that hurt's going to be there. Every time you think about it, come around that person. But you got to continue loving those who need forgiven. Matthew 5:44, but I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for those that despitefully use you. It goes against every human nature, but it is the call that we're given. So the application, 4 easy steps. Simple. I said easy again. I'm sorry. Simple. Not easy. Identify specific instances in your life. Do this on your way home, or you can do it now while I'm saying them. Identify specific instances and ways people have hurt you. Write them down. Get them on paper. Put them in your phone. Just make it known in your life. When you get home, make some time this evening before you go to bed and pray through this list. Admit to God your feelings and anger, your bitterness that you've gathered over these people or these instances in your life where you've been hurt. And again, forgiveness isn't saying this person didn't hurt me. You need to acknowledge that you were hurt. That's not what forgiveness is. Pray through this list and admit it to God. Say, hey, this is what I'm feeling. Release the bitterness that you've harbored against each person in each offense, and do it like this. Be specific. God, I forgive this person for this, for exactly what they did. And this is the hard part, right? Release that person to God and trust that God will use the situation for good as He sees fit, just like He did in Joseph's life. And then lastly, thank God for the forgiveness that He has given to you every time that you've sinned. And if you keep that in your mind, that will make it a lot easier to forgive other people. Because if God wasn't willing to forgive me so many times every day, I would be hopeless. So that's it. Easy, a simple application to an extremely complex and difficult problem in our lives. Forgiveness. Selflessness. Trying to let God take over it. That's all I've got for you this morning.